And welcome to the Jean Cocteau Cinema and Bookstore and Art Gallery and, Juggling Emporium or whatever the hells we are. Bar, yes. Tavern, popcorn dispensary. Uh, for our celebration of the Wild Card series and our anniversary. This is Wild Cards is the longest running shared world anthology series, certainly in science fiction and fantasy, and I think in any genre. And this is our 30th anniversary. First Wild Card book came out in 1987. God help us. And I have an incredible number of wildcard writers here in the first two rows. Far too many to. We took upside down our stage, but even so, we cannot get all of them on stage at the same time. So I will be calling them up in smaller groups and talking to them a little about the story of wildcards and the history and the characters. Um, Over 30 years, of course, we've done many, many wildcard panels at conventions, and we've done some previous wildcard events here. And we've told the story, the how-to story of how wildcard began many times. So we're not going to go into that, the logistics of it in any great detail. If any of you have not heard it before, uh, it actually began because a number of us in Albuquerque and Santa Fe area were role players, and we were playing a number of role-playing games, Moral Project, Call of Cthulhu, not so much Dungeons and Dragons, but some of the more interesting games. And one year, Vic Milan, who's sitting there in the second row, gave me for my birthday a copy of the Super World role-playing game, and he knew I was a comic book fan from way back, and said, "Why don't you run this? This looks like fun." And I did for the next, I don't know, 2 years, 3 years. I essentially stopped writing during that period of time and just concentrated on making up villains to bedevil this group of absolutely obsessive role players. And we started out playing one day a week, mostly at John Miller's house. And we liked that so much we started playing 2 days a week, once at John's house and once at my house up in Santa Fe. And then Walter started running his version of it too, and I think Vic ran a version of it too. So we were playing Superworld like 4 or 5 days a week, pretty much obsessively, and doing nothing else. It was, but we created some amazing characters, and at a certain point, I said, we have to how to figure a way to get our careers back and make some money from this. And these characters are too good just for us. Let's share them with the world. And it was the 1980s, and shared world anthologies were very, very big at that time. Bob Aspirin and Lynn Abbey had led the way with their Thieves World anthologies, which were mega bestsellers, and that had been followed by Heroes in Hell and War World and Greystone Bay and Leovec and Ithcar and numerous others, all of them are gone now. Even Thieves World is gone now. But for a while, they were all over in the 1980s. But no one was doing superheroes. So, and a lot of us, especially me, I think, were old comic book geeks who always had this secret desire to write for Marvel Comics. And I certainly had that desire. In fact, when I got out of college in 1971, I applied for a job at Marvel Comics, but they failed to hire me. And so I had to go into the career I went to instead. That worked out okay for me. Uh, so we created Wildcards. We created this shared world, and we've been running with it ever since. There have been ups and downs, there have been starts and stops. The initial group of writers, which probably numbered about 10 to 12, started out with the people who had actually played the game, but that wasn't enough, so I broadened it by asking other people from outside the Albuquerque and Santa Fe area to join us too, and that was our initial group. And over the years, that group has grown. Some people have dropped out. A couple of our very fine writers have unfortunately passed away, and others have moved on to other endeavors and stopped writing for wildcards. But in their place, new generations of writers have come in, and with new characters, which I, as editor, have always enjoyed because I think the new writer the new character brings a great deal of excitement and new possibilities to the series. So we're gonna do that, and we're gonna continue to do that. Now, for those of you who haven't read a lot of Shared Worlds, you know, basically the premise of a shared world is you're creating a universe together. All the stories take place against a common background. Um, but everybody controls their own character. It's not work made for hire like working for a DC and all that. You're not assigned to write a character. You have your character, and you write, or characters, because as you'll see when we get into this, some people didn't stop at one, but they created 2 or 3 or 12 or 37 characters. I'm looking at you, Kevin. And you write your own characters, but they meet everybody, they interact with everybody. So your character may meet my character and fight with my character, or fall in love with my character, or try to kill my character, or form a association to play dominoes with my character. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting possibilities, and the writers all work that out together. So let's start here by bringing up 2 of the writers who were there right from the very beginning, Melinda M. Snodgrass and Howard Waldrop. Now, what's interesting about these 2 particular writers is I've just told the story of how Wildcards began with this role-playing game. And Melinda was a crucial part of the role-playing game. She was, we often had sessions at her house and all that. But when we created Wildcards, Melinda did not bring across any of her characters from the role-playing game. She created a brand new character for the series. And Howard lived in Austin, Texas at the time, and Howard and I knew each other from comics fandom. We knew each other from 1963, when both of us were high school kids, and I bought his copy of Brave and Bold number 28, the first appearance of the Justice League of America, for a quarter. I still have Justice League number 28, or Brave and Bold number 28. Howard no longer has the quarter. But Howard and I started corresponding. We corresponded for 9 years before we actually met at a science fiction convention in Kansas City. And I knew, number one, he was a brilliant writer, and number 2, that he loved comic books. He loved these old comic book heroes. He loved pulp heroes, so I wanted him to be a part of this. So he came in and, of course, created the character. Now, I'll have to tell you, I don't know if there's anyone here who's never read Wildcard, but some of this discussion, some spoilers may come out, because we're going to have to just talk about some of the things that happened in the stories and all that. But Howard created Jet Boy. And Melinda's Dr. Tachyon, Howard's Jet Boy, 2 characters who did not appear in the role-playing game were the 2 characters that we started off with. And Dr. Tachyon and his race of aliens, the Takesians, started all the fucking trouble, and they're the ones who first appear. Why don't you talk a little about how that happened, Snob?
Sure. Well, as George talked about, we ended up sitting over breakfast after playing Superworld until 3 in the morning, I think, and George stayed over at the house. That's when he said we have to find a way to make money off this obsession. But as we were talking and saying, what about and George said, what about a shared world? And he said to me, I really hate the kind of superhero origin stories where you're standing in a toxic waste dump and you get struck by lightning and then you get superpowers. And everybody has a different origin story. He said, I want a single origin story. So I thought, I was sitting there and I said, well, what about an alien virus? And it's being tested on Earth. And then it either bestows powers or it horribly deforms you or it kills you. And having then made that suggestion, George said, well, that sounds good. So who are the aliens? Me and my big mouth, I suddenly had to create these aliens and their culture. So I started coming up with the Takesians, and I actually remember talking with Vic, brainstorming with Vic about it, the concept of Virtu. Sage, we need you down here, babe. Yes, and the idea that they're highly honorable, but also flamboyant. I studied opera in Vienna. I was going to be a great opera star, except I'm not exactly built for it. And I love that kind of over-the-top, drama. And so I gave the Takesians that sort of quality that you may fail, but if you fail magnificently, it still is considered a win, in a strange way. And so I came up with a character, a scientist who had been part of this original project to develop this alien virus. This was a race of people where the upper classes, the 1%, if you will, had mental powers. Were telepathic, they had mind control, but they wanted physical prowess. They wanted the kind of superhero abilities that we see in the comics. So they developed this virus, but they weren't going to test it on themselves because that would be stupid. So they found a planet with creatures who were genetically identical, and there's an explanation for that. We did work that out. And they brought the virus to Earth. And my character, Dr. Tachyon, had a sudden case of conscience, and he said, this is terrible, what we're doing, even though he had been one of the scientists developing. He said, we must stop this. And so he tries to race to Earth to prevent the release of the virus and fails spectacularly. But then, of course, the person he relies on to fix the problem also fails spectacularly.
Well.
And so we end up with a world that has superheroes and jokers and lots of dead people, and a world that has fundamentally changed in some ways and not in others. So we hope in interesting ways.
Dr. Tachyon races to Earth with his spaceship and the other spaceship that's supposed to
Release the
release
virus.
the thing, and
They have a space battle.
They have a space battle, and the bad guys lose, and their spaceship crashes. But the item containing the wildcard virus gets lost in New Jersey,
We build them good, you
where
know.
it's indistinguishable from the other toxic waste. Now Howard, of course, Howard was not part of the role playing group. Howard is one of the most brilliant writers you're ever going to meet. He's been my friend a long time. He's also the stubbornest guy in the world, and he marches to the beat of his own drummer, and he doesn't play well with others. So we brought him into the thing. And if you know Howard, and some of his fellow Austonians can verify this, before Howard writes a story, he talks about it for a year, or 2 years, or 5 years, or 20 years. He was just out there talking about the search for Tom Perdue and Moon World, 2 novels he's been writing since he was in high school. But we know about them because he likes to talk about them. And he'd been talking about this Jet Boy story for a long time. Jet Boy, not being a superhero with any real superpowers, but just a kid with a jet plane, a homage to Air Boy. So I said, look, you want to write this Jet Boy story anyway, why don't you come write it for Wild Cards? And he said yes, but he had a condition, which was it had to be set in September of 1946, and the virus had to be released on his birthday, September 15th, 1946. Up to then, we figured we'd be starting this in 1986.
Yeah, that was our plan.
Which was that, but we wanted Howard, so we caved into him. Why don't you tell us about Air Boy and where Jet Boy came from and where the Jet Boy story came from?
Well, okay. The Easy Air Boy was a comic book. He was in Air Fighters and in his own comic book, and it ran from 1941 to 1953. And he had a plane called Birdie, which flew like a bat, and it was telepathically controlled by Air Boy and stuff. And I always loved those stories because they were great. The heap stories, the guy, like the precursor of Swamp Thing and Man Thing and all those, ran in the back of Air Boy comics for years. Right, it was the second feature. But anyway, I wanted a kid with essentially a jet plane, right? And my original story. See, I'd been thinking about this story for a while. My original story, there was no virus and stuff because I didn't know about all this stuff. It was some people getting a hold of an A-bomb in 1946, right? From the American government, and then the rest of the story was much like the story eventually ends up. But anyway, in other words, I had done the 1946 thing because I had a backstory on Jet Boy. Jet Boy had been the only person with a jet plane up until 1944 when the Germans got the ME-262 and stuff. And anyway, Jet Boy had spent the last part of the war on a his plane had landed on the deserted island, and that's where all the stuff comes in with it, with the comic book publisher, Jet Boy on Dinosaur Island, right? Because he was there, and they said what was there, and he said, well, a few lizards and stuff, and the guy says, oh, Jet Boy on Dinosaur Island, I can see it now, right? But anyway. I had this whole background. That's why I insisted to George and stuff that it had to start in 1946. And I thought the idea of, a virus coming in 1946 would give more depth and stuff to the series and stuff rather than starting it right now, right?
It did. You were right about
It
that.
did, you were right, yeah.
Annoying, but right.
Anyway, that's where I was originally thinking of the story to sell to Jessica Amanda Salmonson's Fantastic Heroes. Was that the name of her anthology?
Could have been. I don't
Right.
remember.
Because there were lots there. That's the whole thing about 1985 and 86 and stuff. Because we actually wrote the stories in 85. It wasn't published till 87, but there was a lot going on in comic books. Then there was Dark Knight and stuff coming out, or the Watchmen were coming out. All this stuff, all this comic book revanchism was going on, right?
And were you following that? Were you still reading comic books at the time? Did you read Watchmen as it came
I
out?
had to read Watchmen when it came out because so many people had brought it to me and said, "Read this," right? But and that was when it was in the 12
issues,
12 volume comic books and stuff. But anyway, there was all this stuff going on. There was revisionism going on in westerns and in comic books and mysteries and stuff. Anyway, I figured we should be part of that, right? And stuff. And I thought y'all had done the role playing stuff and come along at exactly the right time. But I'd be damned if I was going to start my story in 1986, right? It had to start in 1946. But because for one thing, I wanted the company rehearsing Eugene O'Neill's The Iceman Cometh on Broadway went out into the street and watched the dogfight over Broadway, right? And stuff. I wanted that scene in there because I thought of that originally in the when I thought of the A-bomb story. But anyway, that's how the story came to be, because I had conceived the same story but without the mechanism of the.
Now, here's the first of the big spoilers here that we have to address here. But anyone who's read any Wild Cards at all knows this happens here. Jet Boy fails. I mean, Dr. Todd and his 5 blimps are about to release the bomb over the city, and Jet Boy, only his jet can get up to the height of these blimps. And so he crashes the blimps into the gondola. It's a terrific sequence. The story is 30 minutes over Broadway. It's a marvelous story. But Jet Boy gets shot and the bomb gets released, and Jet Boy and it's Todd, is it Todd or his henchman? It's one of them, are standing on the bomb as it descends toward Manhattan, trading punches. It's incredible, and that's your tribute, I think, to Slim Pickens, right? And and the scene from Dr. Strangelove. Yeah, it's a great scene. But obviously, the virus gets released, or we wouldn't have had any series. Now, I've always wondered, in your original conception, does Jet Boy fail, or does he prevent the detonation of the atomic bomb?
In the original conception, he failed from the start. I mean, the story was written, but he was going to fail at the end. Of course, saving America from the.
Well, if the atomic bomb goes off, he doesn't save anyone.
Save America.
Right, but I don't think the bomb was going to go off in my story.
Okay.
But they were going to, go down with the bomb.
He was going to die, but he was going to
die
prevent the
anyway,
bomb from going off.
Right, exactly, right.
Yeah, which would have been a little more successful than he was in our story.
Right.
But despite which, he's a great hero. There's some interesting side things to this story. This is difficult to say in the light of 9/11. which came obviously later in 2001. This was, remember, 1986 that we were doing these stories. But I always hated the World Trade Towers, the Twin Towers. I grew up in New York, and I loved the Empire State Building. King Kong climbing the Empire State Building, and like a lot of people, I thought someone once said that the World Trade Towers looked like the box the Empire State Building came in. And I didn't want them in our New York. So I wanted our New York to still have the Empire State Building as the tallest building in the world. So before the Twin Towers were built, there was a railroad terminal on what we now call Ground Zero on that land. New York has the Grand Central Station, and it has Penn Station, but it also had Hudson Terminal, where trains from New Jersey put in. And I said, have the remains of Jet Boy's plane crash on Hudson Terminal and burn it down, and then they'll build Jet Boy's tomb there. And therefore, we never had the Twin Towers, and therefore, inadvertently, we could never have 9/11 because we'd already had it in 1946, and we have instead Jet Boy's tomb, on which I remember. It's not like Howard wrote his story and the rest of us all read it. We put this book together, and everybody's writing their stories simultaneously. So Howard's writing a story, and other people who are in the book with their own characters are writing stories. And I get asked by people, well, what were, Jet Boy would have this tomb. He tried saving New York. He's revered and all that. What would be his final words? So I asked Howard, can you please give us some final words for Jet Boy? And he gave us, Howard.
Dr. Todd puts a gun to him, and they're fighting over the gun, and he says, "Die, Jet Boy, die." And Jet Boy says, "I can't die yet. I haven't seen the Jolson story," which is a line given by Larry Fine in a Three Stooges comedy from 1946. Because the slug line on the Jolson story was, if you only see one movie before you die, make it the Jolson story. I'm not kidding, right?
And in the story, Jet Boy is constantly going to see movies.
Right, yes. Before he went off to war and after he came back from the war, he spent most of his time in movie theaters watching movies, right?
Now, the Melinda's backstory has the spaceship destroyed, and the bomb is lost somewhere in New Jersey, where this Dr. Todd finds it. But meanwhile, Dr. Tachyon lands his own spaceship at White Sands and is taken to President Truman, and he's telling them, well, this is virus, I'm an alien from outer space, etc. There's this virus here. Howard could not accept this. So he writes me a story in which they're telling President Truman that this is a Nazi superweapon. And I'm saying, Howard, he landed a spaceship at White Sands and all that, but getting Howard to make any editorial changes is very difficult here.
Well, and George, you did a very nice job with what became ultimately our interstitial. I mean, George was writing sort of as Studs Terkel, as all the way through this first book, sort of commenting on the events as we moved from 46 up to 86 in the first volume. I mean, one of the things I wanted to talk about Tachyon is in retrospect, I mean, George and I have gotten a lot better at this, doing this and editing this as time has gone on. I gave Tachyon mental powers, and the mind control thing was fine, but the telepathy was a bitch, excuse me. We should never have done that. And we've pretty much said no more telepathic powers in the Wildcards universe because it makes it really difficult, if not impossible, to do a mystery. So I was having to come up with all of these stupid rules about, Takesian behavior and courtesy and so forth about why he didn't read people's minds, because otherwise, we were like, oh dear, well, there goes the mystery. Tachyon reads their minds. And as any of you have seen Jessica Jones, the new terrific show on Netflix, mind control, I mean, Tachyon uses it for good because he wants to be a hero, but it is a terrifying power, as was evidenced in that TV show. So as I've been developing this for television, I've just said, he isn't telepathic. We're not doing that. He can have mind control, because they wanted him to have some powers, the alien character. But I said, no telepathy. For one thing, it's terrible on television. You've got these horrible voiceovers, and it's just too powerful a power. It makes editing and writing very difficult. So, yeah, I mean, the culture I created in order to get around this was just crazed.
And where did the impulse come from to have Dr. Tachyon dressed like a 70s pimp, crossed with one of the Musketeers?
No, he's more Prince. Think of him as Prince, that sort of elaborate. Well, you can't make an impression if you're just wearing a three-piece dark suit. I mean, my God, one must stand out. So the Takesians tend to, elaborate costumes, and he sang opera, so I wanted, coats and gold embroidered waistcoats and lace. I love the 18th century. Men knew how to dress in the 18th century. And so I was going for that kind of look, and I thought that would be a fun thing to do. And then I subsequently wrote a novel where Tachyon goes home. And in the 40, 50 years he's been gone, fashion has completely changed. And so he comes back, expecting it to be the world he left, and now everybody's wearing skin-tight jumpsuits, with elaborate patterns, and he's like, what the heck, wait. It was more that. It was just to sort of feed that idea of the flamboyance, the look at me, I'm fantastic, was partly why I did it, and also the 18th century is cool. They had great clothes.
They still didn't wear black, though, and that was one thing. Tachyon never wore black. He liked flamboyant, bright colors, and when he goes back in Melinda's novel, he takes a couple of the friends, characters you'll hear about shortly, with him, and also his psychotic grandson Blaze, who's one of our great villains. And Blaze only wears black at that point in his career. So, there's one scene that I remember at a big Takesian ball where there's hundreds of Takesian novels wandering around dressed in puce and aquamarine and these clashing colors in Blaze all in black. And I remember my character Jay Aykroyd says, it was easy to find Blaze. He looked like a raisin in a fruit salad.
Hey, I had fun with that line. Do I get to interview you when you come up with your characters, primarily Turtle, because he's a great character?
Maybe later. I don't know.
Yeah, okay. So should we wrap up and bring other people up?
A lot of the guys who were here, who we'll be bringing up shortly, were part of the group, and they were writing stories for this too. But as I said, I did reach out beyond the confines of the people in the group. One of the people I reached out to, brilliant writer, was my close friend, my mentor in a sense, Roger Zelazny, here of Santa Fe, one of the great science fiction writers of all time, who I knew, because I'd hung around with him, was also a secret comic book fan. In fact, he owned a copy of Marvel Mystery #1 with the issue of the introduction of the Human Torch, the first Human Torch, and Submariner, which is like one of the two most valuable comics of all time. Roger eagerly signed up to take part, and he created a character, Croyd Crenson, the Sleeper, probably the most iconic wildcard character, who we still write about today, even though we lost Roger in 1995 and broke our hearts. And Roger picked up right away on this whole shared world thing and how you riff off each other. So his story, Croyd Crenson is a junior high school kid when this starts. And he's one of the people, like Howard talked about, who sees the fight in the sky. He's at school, he's in class, and suddenly there's Jet Boy is fighting in the sky with Dr. Todd, and the blimps are clashing, and the sirens are ringing, and people are being sent home, and Jet Boy, or Croyd walks
Crenson.
home, and the virus is released, and people are dying, and being horribly all
Transformed all around him, yeah.
So the one thing Roger asked, though, is, there's one thing I have to be sure of here, because he's got to be in school. It has to be a school day. So, Howard, are you sure that September 15th, 1946 is a school day? And Howard says, absolutely, definitely, it's a Tuesday. So after the stories are all written and we're moving towards publication, we find out that it's a Sunday. And it's the only time in my life I saw Roger really lose it, where he took his pipe out of his mouth in my living room, and God damn, threw it across the room. So Howard, how do you explain this?
I was always told that I was born on a Tuesday.
There are these things called calendars.
1946 calendar.
Well, this is an alternate world.
Right. You see, I started to say George. George was the only one who had read everything, and he explained what the thing about.
Use your mic.
I had a brilliant. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I had a brilliant thing in there from Harry Truman's point of view, sitting in the White House as Tachyon is leaving after talking to him, right? You know, and it was a stream of consciousness thing from Harry Truman, okay, and of course that had to go, but anyway. George is the only one who'd read this, and he'd read everything else. He explained what I had, the cover story, so badly to Melinda that she got out of a taxi cab coming to a convention, and I went out to meet her, and she ran toward me saying, "Why did you make Tachyon a Nazi?"
And on that note,
And of course, I had no idea what she was talking about. Because George had explained it so badly. I said the cover story is, right, because they saw Tachyon land at White Sands, right, that this was a Nazi, a Nazi invention, and he was a Nazi, a Nazi scientist. That was the cover story that was put out to the
More believable than aliens.
Exactly right. Exactly. See, right. In 1946, people could understand that, right? But George explained it so badly to Melinda, she thought I'd made Tachyon a Nazi, right?
Howard kept saying that we needed the cover story because Harry Truman, it would have blown his mind. Harry Truman could not have accepted Nazis, and or aliens. Could not have accepted aliens. It was too far outside his worldview. And he said this many, many times. And I finally got him on a panel at Kansas City. I got him to say it on a panel, whereupon I produced a newspaper headline showing President Truman meeting with some Greys in the White House. Conclusive proof that Harry Truman met with aliens. It was right there in the National Enquirer. How could it be wrong?
well, shall we bring up some more of our fabulous writers?
Yes, why don't we send the two of you away and bring up Walter, Vic, John, Leanne, and Bud.
Somebody take this. You want to take this?
All right, well, these are all people who are part of our first generation. Walter John Williams, Victor Milan, John Miller were all part of the role-playing group that gave birth to the game, and they were all with their characters in Volume 1 and carried forward from there. Leanne was also in Volume 1 with her character, although she was from Denver, so she was not part of the role-playing group. And Bud came in with Volume 2, I believe, was the first story there, and he was part of the Austin group, who, Howard was from Austin, and we also had Lou Shiner, who is not with us today, but was a very important early contributor to Wildcard with the very popular character Fortunato. So all of you guys were there right at the beginning, and Walter. Let me start with Walter. Walter is interesting. In some ways, he wrote the first Wildcard story, as he likes to tell us. Walter was so eager to do this that even when the game was still in conceptual stages, he went off and wrote a story. But this was before Howard laid down his smack about 1946. So he wrote a 1985 story that was somewhat tonally different than what we did. And it was a story about Modular Man, who would be one of the characters that Walter played in the game, Modular Man and his crazed inventor, Dr. Travnicek. Walter had many characters in the game. Modular Man was only one. He also had Black Shadow, who later made the transition and appeared in some wildcard volumes. He also had a Scottish character called the Highlander, who did not appear in wildcards, at least not yet, but you can never tell. But when Howard laid his smackdown in 1946, Walter didn't do any of his game characters. He created a character who never appeared in the game, but remains one of the most iconic wildcard characters today, the Golden Boy, Jack Braun. Why don't you talk a little about how Jack came to be?
Okay, well, remember we were working in 1986, and Howard said, well, the story actually begins in 1946. And so I began to wonder what actually happened in the interim. And so I wrote a timeline taking the Wildcards universe from 1946 to 1986. And one of the items that I tossed off was 1952, the Wildcards 17 are persecuted by the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And George said, I kind of like that, but they have to be fewer than 17 of them. You can't... knock it down to a reasonable number. So, okay, they're the four aces. Well, who are they and what do they do? Okay. So I created two of the original four aces who were in the Wildcards universe, were the original superhero team, and who were blamed for losing China to communism. But Golden Boy, I thought I based him on. Suddenly, I forgot the name of the actor who was also in Dr. Strangelove, who played General Jack D. Ripper. Sterling Hayden. I based him on Sterling Hayden, who was brought before the committee and who gave up his girlfriend, among other things, as a communist, and who wrote a book about it in which he described exactly how despicable he was. Sterling Hayden had, I think, very low self-esteem. Not just from that, but from other stuff. But anyway, but Sterling Hayden was this, enormously handsome, successful actor whose career kind of went into decline after his appearance before the committee. And so I based Golden Boy, Jack Braun, on that character. And I just wanted to show what the limits of superpowers are. Jack Braun is good-looking, he's eternally youthful, he's enormously powerful, he's basically invulnerable, and so far as we know, he doesn't die, which is all pretty good, but he couldn't stop history, even given his powers, that when the American politics swung in that direction, and wildcards began to be investigated as threats to national security, he wasn't able to stop that from happening. And because he was a good soldier, basically, and he always tried to serve his country, and now his country was saying, well, you have to betray your closest friends. And that's what he did. And then he had to live with it forever, all right, because he doesn't die. He has to live with it forever, and that's his story.
And Walter's story from Volume 1, Witness, which told Jack's story, was nominated for a Nebula, the only wildcard story to date. I hope it changes someday to be a Nebula finalist. Didn't win, but what the hell. It's a proud and lonely thing to be a loser.
I had a lot of practice in that over the years.
It also had some fans writing us to say that Walter had done an wonderful imaginative feat by inventing UAC and the Red Scare. Surely nothing like that could ever happen in America, but in this alternate world we created, it was strange. Did you intend Witness to be a one-off story and never to hear from Jack again? Because it seemed that way but of course you did bring him back. In
Well,
later
yeah,
books.
well, we never came back to the 1950s, or at least, not until
Right.
very recently. But so I I figured that Jack would sort of be in the background, but I gave him an ending. He became a real estate entrepreneur in California after his Hollywood career collapsed. Yeah, he went through several divorces and he lost all his Hollywood money, so he got the chance to be Tarzan on TV. And he played Tarzan for 3 seasons, got his money back, invested it in Los Angeles real estate, and became very rich and successful, so long as he stayed away from getting married, which so far has not been a problem for him.
Well, he did
But
get
anyway,
married
yeah,
like 3 or 4 times. as
he
I
has
recall.
he has reappeared occasionally when sort of the time is right for that, when there's an actual good story to write about him.
Now, some of the stuff that went on in the first volume, I think, was to my mind, proof of what Wildcard can do when it's really functioning on all cylinders and people are working together and we're interacting. And I'm talking about the way the stories riff off each other and the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Walter, you've heard about Howard's Jet Boy story and Jet Boy's last words. Walter began his story with the line, "Jack was watching the Jolson story," when, which I thought was a brilliant riff and a way to begin it. And
Well, yeah, he couldn't die till he'd seen the Jolson story, but after he saw the Jolson story, he couldn't die. So,
And the other thing is, we did create the 4 aces. Jack created Black Eagle and Golden Boy, but that still have 2 aces. So I pitched in with a character called the Envoy, and Melinda pitched in with a character called Blythe, or Brain Trust, who becomes the lover of Dr. Tachyon. And Walter's story and Melinda's book 1 story, Degradation Rights, are really 2 halves of a
Yeah.
greater whole, telling the full story of what happened to all 4 races when they were dragged before UAC and the tragedies that ensued for Jack, but also for Blythe and for Tachyon. And then with the second volume, you switched to some of your game characters. You introduced
Yeah.
Modular Man.
Modular Man was okay. When we were playing Superworld, it didn't take long for me to realize that Superworld was a really rules-heavy set of rules with lots of complicated interactions between the various rules. So I wanted a character that was really flexible, that, if it turned out that this element of the character didn't work, I could change it. So I invented Modular Man, whose powers all come from various modules. And if one of the modules isn't suitable, he swaps it out for one that's better. So that worked really well in terms of the game. But as a Wildcards character, he's kind of unique because Modular Man, though he has all these powers and does superheroic stuff all the time, has no actual Wildcards powers. He's someone else's Wildcards power. His creator, Dr. Travnicek, is a Wildcard, and his power is to be able to create this android.
Right.
So then you have, and also the android has to obey him, and he's pretty crazed.
He's our mad scientist.
He's one of several mad scientists we encounter in the course of, because mad science is taught at all the universities in the Wildcards universe, I think. I think so far he's the only superpowered character in the Wildcards universe that is not an actual Wildcard.
I'll have to think about that, but he's certainly up there. Yes, he's
Yeah.
one of the few. There might be more. We've had hundreds of characters since. So, moving on to Vic for a minute, Victor Milan, who started the whole thing by giving me that game. Vic was another one of the people in the original Superworld game. A lot of the characters Vic played in the Superworld game, though, were his own riffs on characters he'd encountered elsewhere. He played a character called Hawk, who was basically Hawk from Spencer, given super strength. He played a character called Dancer, who was basically the gunslinger from Mike Resnick's Intergalactic Midway show, or whatever it's called. Fun characters to play with. But he also created, speaking of flexibility, one of the most crazed, original, and flexible characters, both in Superworld, and that is Mark Meadows, a.k.a. Captain Trips. So when Howard threw us the curveball and said 1946, you jumped on the '60s right away with that and ran with Trips as your character. Was there much adjustment in changing him from the game to the books?
Actually, yeah, but it was mostly a change in mindset. I had to think more deeply about his personal motivation and his personal life. I think Sprout was actually in the game, wasn't she? She was one of his disadvantages.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And so a lot of it made the way across, but I also had to adjust a lot of the characters. But the basic conception of him was always that he was representing the kind of naive optimism and idealism of the hippie movement of the '60s. But also, it turns out he represented some of the darker side, as comes out later. And Trips's power was that Mark Meadows was a genius biochemist, and his wild card power was that he could combine various, frankly, illicit drugs into potions that would transform him temporarily into superpowered characters. And that's you talk about how do our characters differ from mainstream comic characters. There weren't a lot of heroes in Marvel or DC whose power was doing drugs. But that was Mark.
Well, there's Mighty Mouse.
Well, yeah, that's true.
And
Actually,
Popeye.
and Popeye, yeah, he did spinach, but
That's what he called it.
yeah.
Now Vic had five five. Mark Meadows had five avatars, friends, as he called them, each of whom had a completely different personality and a completely different set of powers. And that was in the game.
Yeah.
But the Radical was not in the game.
No. However, he was always in my mind as a possible outcome of Mark Meadows, as was a certain other character.
Yes, Monster. When those of you who played role-playing games know you roll dice for many things in a role-playing game, and occasionally you roll dice badly, which is called a fumble. And whenever Mark Meadows took one of his potions, Vic had to roll in the game for his transformation. But he built into the character, which only I was the game master and Vic was the player. Only we knew this. If Vic had fumbled that transformation roll at any point, he would have turned into not one of the five friendly and useful things, but into Monster, which would have attacked all of the other characters he was playing with and killed them horribly. And yet, even though we played this game for years, Vic never...
Dice roller. Yeah.
Actually, I'm not. That's one of the things. I was famously the worst dice roller in history. I was the king of the fumble. I would roll 20s.
Yeah, we would always talk about, I had Vic dice that night.
Yeah. I did things like, okay, roll your dexterity. Well, you're on the edge of an abyss, and actually, no, it wasn't even that. It's roll your dexterity, 20, I trip. Okay, roll 20 for the result. I roll a 20. Okay, well, you fall into an abyss and die. It was, that was the kind of thing I did, and yet, in the years we played the campaign, and Tripsy was my main character, and transformed a whole lot. Never once did I fumble that roll.
So we never got to see Monster until Wildcards, where of course we had to appear, because you can't hang a monster on the wall in Act 1 and not let him go off into eventually. So those of you who read Wildcard will encounter all of Trips's various personas, including the Radical, who was invented for the books, and the Monster.
Well, actually, really quickly, the Radical was also one I had in mind, I think, as representing, as one part of what represented the darker side, the more strident and violent and dogmatic part of the hippie movement. And then Monster was the extreme.
And you developed a relationship between Mark and Dr. Tachyon. I mean, that was one of the things of playing off other people's characters. I think that was an important thing, that he had a strong friendship there.
Yeah, that's true. That actually was a holdover from the game. Trips was a close friend of Melinda's character, the Doctor, and in as I recall, the in the Wild Cards world, Tachyon was one of the few who knew Captain Trips' secret. Now, Captain Trips himself had kind of the most unconvincing disguise this side of Clark Kent. He was a tall, skinny, gangly, bearded guy with a long blonde ponytail to start with, and he would dress up because they'd had superhero comics in the 30s and 40s before the Wild Cards outmoded them, and he was impressed by all of those, and so he had his own suit, which was a purple Uncle Sam suit with the hat and everything. And he hung out. They'd let him into the Aces Only club, like Aces High, because they thought he was a harmless lunatic, and Tachyon vouched for him, and they were all humoring him. But then when danger threatened, he would take one of his potions and turn into somebody who did not, in any way, shape, or form, resemble either Mark Meadows or Captain Trips. So his identity was nonetheless preserved in this way. And I guess part of it was his disguise as Tripsy worked because nobody had any idea who the hell Mark Meadows was. He was just some random hippie burnout living in New York.
If I remember right, too, your 5 avatars, even though they dressed in superhero drag, didn't actually hide their identities.
Oh no, they were up front. Now they had alter egos themselves. They had real names that they were known by. But yeah, J.J. Flash Esquire was that, and Moonchild was Isis Moon. They identified themselves as both things.
One of the things that Wild Cards has had is, we're a series that's been going 30 years and talking about superpowers, but we're not. I know, I have a watch. We're going to 6:30 here, so. Okay, they think it's 6. No, they know. I'm sorry, now I've lost my thought. We're not conventional superheroes. Very few people wear costume. Vic's characters, were the 5 avatars, and Captain Trips himself were the only ones who wore anything approximating a conventional superhero spandex costume. So that was one aspect of it here. Now, John Joseph Miller, another one of our originals here, did have a character who wore a mask and a hood, and his nom de guerre was Yeoman, and he did conceal his identity. So he was conventional in the sense that he had a secret identity, and he wore a mask to conceal his real identity, although mostly he just wore a black T-shirt and black jeans, aside from that.
That's right.
And he was our archer. We created this world, and we said, okay, this virus is getting loose, and many people are turning into hideous jokers where they get an unfortunate mutation, and other people are turning into aces. Create your character. And John, of course, decided his character would be neither ace nor joker, because that's just the way he plays.
That's just the way I roll, yes, and roll the dice.
So what was your thought with the creation of Yeoman?
Well, I like George, I was a huge comic book fan growing up, and I particularly liked the Archer characters, especially Hawkeye in the Marvel Universe. Green Arrow in DC was a little too, with the arrow car and the aeroplane and, probably the arrow safety razor he shaved with in the mornings and the arrow this and that. Also, he was a pale imitation of Bruce Wayne. But I wanted to do, and of course, being comics at the time, they had the flare arrows and the boxing glove arrows and all that, and I didn't want to do that shit. So he basically used, razor-tipped hunting, broadheads, which is also why he wore a mask, 'cause he killed a lot of people. Yeah. And plus he was in the country illegally because he was a Vietnam veteran who, at the time, at the end of it all, got disgusted and walked away at the fall of Saigon and ended up as a merc in the Far East for a while. But then eventually...
It's worth mentioning, for those who know your comic books and history, that John's Yeoman came before the Longbow Hunter series, which redefined Green Arrow along the lines that John had pioneered, and also, I believe, before the Punisher.
Yes.
So
yes.
You were the first really psychopathic, murderous vigilante.
He wasn't psychopathic. you know, he had a quest, you know, that he was on.
West,
And
yes.
he, you know, and he killed a lot of bad people along the way. But still, at the end, you know, regretted some of the things that happened. You know, for him, it was a continuation of a war that had started in Vietnam with following a guy who came to America and made a fortune in dry cleaning establishments, and who had killed his wife at the time, his pregnant wife at the time.
So why did you make him a gnat instead of like
Well,
an ace who had
right.
magical archer ability?
Right. Well, I always loved the idea of the Zen archer thing. So he did spend time in a monastery in an attempt to tame his personality, and became a monk and a Zen archer and all that stuff. But then he was, you know, called back, and then he retired and was living in peace in upstate New York. But he was called back to New York City by a friend of his, a Vietnamese friend of his, when they found out that the guy who was their mutual enemy was, you know, a millionaire living in New York City and the head of a secret crime family as well. So I always had the idea that I wanted to show also a normal guy driven to extremes, but who's able to function in a world of aces and superpowers. And, you know, he was not going to beat certain aces. There were a lot of people a lot more powerful than him, but he did his job, what he considered his job, and he did it. And then when the quest was over, I retired him, because I always had that as a ending point. You know, he would achieve
like
his goals and he would retire.
12 books later or something, wasn't it?
No, it was in book. I think the last Yeoman's. Well, I brought him back.
9,
as
I think.
9. I brought him back as in a cameo in my novel, but he's done. You know, his story's told, and he retired back to his place in upstate New York, where he's a landscape artist, and moved on to other when
when you started him, you had this story that you wanted to tell about his quest,
yeah,
his crusade.
it was tough
And you
working
were
that
constantly
in.
getting, you know, sidetracked by alien invasions
right.
and other things.
I had to save the world once or twice. You know, it was, you know, this is superhero stuff after all. So you know, I know you let me go my own way in a few stories so I could solve the thing, you know. But that was part of it. I didn't want to continue this forever. This was not I didn't want the sideshow of Yeoman to go on forever. You know, I wanted characters that could be more of part of the mainstream,
Right.
of the universe. So he was fun while doing him, and I did not use, you know, the boxing glove arrows and all that crap, you know. But it was, in fact, the first story was called "Comes a Hunter," and that was basically my theory is he comes down to New York City in a bus, gets off at Grand Central Station, and, you know, it's the hunter come to the city, you know, and it was kind of, and I think the second story I let off with a quote from Raymond Chandler, so kind of noirish, you know, dark streets, down these mean streets a man must walk who's without fear type thing, you know, so.
So, Walton Simons, was one of the people who joined us from outside the Albuquerque, Santa Fe axis, and who was not part of the game. Did you even play role play down there in Austin with your group?
Oh, sure. I played D&D.
Okay, D&D. And you created, in your first appearance here, a villain. You were the first person who, instead of creating a hero, went out and created a villain. Although, when you were first asked to be part of this, you gave us Sign Girl and Grow Grip Man, which
Yes.
were
And
I did
Puddle
not
Man.
accept.
Eventually, I wrote a Puddle Man story. So.
Why don't you tell us about your character?
I don't know what kind of a headspace I was in when I created Demise. You know, I thought, this is a hard luck guy. And his hard luck extends to the fact that he dies. He draws the Black Queen and gets brought back. So he's just not going to be a happy-go-lucky fellow. I mean, he has one thing he can do, kill people. I mean, when you've got a hammer, everything in the world looks like a potential corpse.
Right.
So, but I think originally, and of course I'm trying to remember back 30 years, he wasn't going to last quite as long as he did. He was not necessarily a red shirt ace, but I think I remember he was going to get bumped off the next volume, and that just didn't happen.
Did you create him in conjunction with Lou Shiner? Because you were working a lot with Lou. In
I was
those
working
days.
a lot with Lou, but I think I came up with Demise entirely on my own. But then I put him into the Astronomer storyline. Now the Astronomer was a villain. See,
Right.
Demise compared to the Astronomer is like it's not the same. I never really thought of Demise as a true villain. He was just somebody who did a lot of bad things.
They killed mimes when they really deserved it.
Right.
That was.
It is fascinating to see the reaction of the audience to murderers, bad guys, whatever, because it's not a consistent reaction. I mean, Demise was beloved. He was a very popular character. People really liked Demise because he killed people that.
He tried to kill people that irritated him, and I'm sure none of us in this room have ever had that impulse, but
Like
None of us in this room ever had that power.
yes.
the salesman who wanted to sell him a blue suit, I think, as I recall.
Yes, no, and he only wore gray.
Yeah. And mimes, famously mimes.
Right, and a cab driver who honked the horn one too many times.
Yeah, Lou Shiner, of course, who was another of our mainstays from Austin, along with Howard and Bud, had created Fortunato, who was in all four of the first books, and was one of our most popular characters in that day. And Fortunato was a superpowered pimp who got his powers from tantric sex. So he would charge up before going into battle, and his forehead would expand, and he was the most powerful ace. I mean, when people invented powers, Lou really went to town. I mean, Fortunato could do everything. He could fly. He could throw superpowers. He had telepathy. Yes, and he could stop time. That was pretty potent. And he could raise the dead, although in a manner that I won't go into here because there might be young
Good
people in the
choice.
audience. And I think that was part of it was the 80s. Watchmen was coming out, Dark Knight was coming out, and we were all part of the same movement, I think, to take the superhero idea and make it darky and grittier. And Lou wanted to be edgy.
It was
I
a
would.
boxing glove arrow. Large, really.
Right. And Demise was all in that astronomer
Right.
Fortunato circle.
He wouldn't really have fit into the storyline that we were telling at that point. I mean, he was just, this hard luck guy who went around killing people for money. But when he got tied into the Astronomer, that was a way to, insert him into the overall storyline.
Now, there was another thing that also came up at the same time that led to Bud's other character. And it goes all the way back to that story that Walter wrote that never appeared, his apocryphal story that he wrote before we were knowing back to the 40s, which was the Modular Man story in a somewhat different tone. And it had a giant ape in it who climbed the Empire State Building and grabbed the blonde, and which was fine, except I pointed out the wildcard virus doesn't work on animals. We can't have King Kong in that. Well, Bud solved that with this another character, Mr.
Well,
Nobody.
actually, you solved it, George. I came up with a character, but you're the one who said, "Oh, we'll make him the giant gorilla." Because I didn't even know about the giant gorilla. You knew about the giant gorilla, and to sort of indicate the way that George works, he integrated this, and also.
Did he tell you at least beforehand?
Oh yeah, I found out. He gave Mr. Nobody a previous persona as the projectionist, which he got a cameo in the first volume. So George is planting these seeds all along.
Yeah,
And sometimes we know about him, and sometimes we don't.
Bud's character, Mr. Nobody, his other non-villainous character, was a sort of a guy who could change his face to look like anybody.
Yeah, or his body. I mean, he could just look like anybody. And the inspiration for this came from Spider-Man 1. It was the Chameleon.
Right.
Although I tried to make him more interesting than Chameleon, who was a pretty dull character. And the name came from, and Howard will remember this, a Betty Boop cartoon.
The thing was, Mr. Nobody was trying to do a nightclub act where he did, turned into Humphrey Bogart and did Humphrey Bogart's voice and turned into, Jimmy Stewart and did Jimmy Stewart. But he was actually shitty at impressions. So he could look
I
like
always
that,
thought
but he
that
wasn't
he
very
was
good.
good at the impressions, but he was a lousy showman. He just didn't know how to sell it.
And then one day, for reasons I forget, he decided to turn into King Kong because he loved old movies. And it caused the New York City blackout, and he got stuck with an ape brain for 20 years and 4 volumes.
Yeah.
Don't turn into King Kong at home, kids.
No. Nothing good comes from it.
And Bud is still writing about Mr. Nobody. He's a
Yes,
character
I
who's
love the
gone on to
character.
this day.
I mean, I love Demise too, but he's gone.
So Leanne was another of our out-of-towners. Leanne came to us from Denver, where she certainly knew comic books because she worked for Mile High Comics, one of the biggest mail order and comic retailers in the world, and had a series of stores. And you were immersed in comic books all over. So when you heard
were
we were doing
inescapable.
Wild Card, did you? Hey, here's a chance to do it right. How did you get in here?
I wanted to do something that was more like the comic characters that I appreciated when I was a kid. Submariner, the Aloner, the loners, the castaways, the people that just did not get along, didn't belong to the Avengers. I liked those characters. And so that was sort of the genesis of what I wanted to do, set in an urban environment because we were in New York. And so what I came up with was a person who had had a very bad acid trip at the same time that the wild card virus hit. And part of that, and why she ended up in an insane asylum, was because her particular power was being able to communicate with animals. And animals die a lot. So she was getting the feedback from all of these deaths, which basically made her insane until she became a sociopath and got much better, and figured out how to actually use this to survive. When she got kicked out of the insane asylum, as many people did back in, I think, the 70s was when it was set, she ended up living in the subway tunnels with a pair of cats and a number of other animals, which is where she met Sewer Jack, who was the other character that tended to revolve around
Who was
my
Ed Bryant's
particular area.
character, our other Denver writer, Weir Alligator. A
Yes.
Cajun subway
Cajun.
worker, sewer worker,
Gay.
yeah, Weir Alligator. And your character was the telepathic animal controlling bag lady,
Yes, yes.
vagabond.
And they got along splendidly. They were about the only people who could get along together splendidly. They didn't do well with anybody else.
So was that why those two characters seldom crossed paths with Modular Man or Captain Trips that are great in power, or was it just that you didn't like us guys?
Well, it was more that they had their own lifestyle, and their own lifestyle didn't really involve showing up at parties with Dr. Tachyon. It just wasn't going to happen. Yeah. Nobody else did except the subway car, which was Ed's and not mine.
Oh,
I'm taking
yes,
no
okay.
responsibility for CC Rider. This subway car.
Right.
Although he did make me write the lyrics for the subway car. I did not escape that. But yeah, I wanted somebody who was dealing with a lot of different problems in addition to just having superpowers, and how she could integrate those superpowers with just basic survival, which was a struggle. for
You
her.
also, of course, created Rosemary Muldoon, the idealistic young crusading DA who was actually Rosa Maria Gambione, the head of one of New York's 5 families, or the daughter of the head of one of New York's 5 families.
Well, and she took over eventually.
Eventually, yes, a couple of things
Yes,
later. here.
yeah, she tried to be someone else until she had an opportunity to be herself, I think.
Which
And-
is another thing where we see the cross-pollination at work, because I'm sitting there as editor and I'm saying, oh, look, Leanna's writing about the mafia. She has a whole gang thing. Oh, look, John is writing about this Asian gang, Kien and the Shadowfist Society. Oh, look, we have two gangs in New York City. Let's have them fight.
Let's have a war.
And eventually that became one of the bases of Book 5, Down and Dirty. So, although that was a thing where John's gang had a bigger advantage because his gang liked aces, and your Italians didn't like aces and jokers much, so they were at a sharp disadvantage. They just had guns.
Yes, yes. Although Rosa Maria was not shy about using anybody she could use.
That's true. Eventually, when she took
No.
over there. Yeah. Did your man go after the mafia too, or he just?
Perhaps peripherally, but nothing, in an organized manner. I mean, he had his hands full, He had an Asian gang to take down by himself. Actually,
And occasional yeast monsters from outer space to deal with.
yeah, and an occasional save the world from the yeast from outer space thing, but, and he was focused. Yeah, I mean, he was a focused guy, so. Yeah, the mafia was basically out of his ken, so.
All right. Does anyone else have anything to add, or should we chase you off and bring up the next batch?
Next batch.
Okay.
Bring up the next batch.
Characters who included the Great and Powerful Turtle and Popinjay, Lou Shiner's Fortunato character, Ed Bryant's Sewer Jack character, and of course Roger Zelazny's immortal The Sleeper. Occasionally, someone else would drop in, like Chris Claremont wrote one story for us. Am I forgetting anyone else? I don't recall. Bill Wu, yeah, Bill Wu with his character Lazy Dragon, who was a fascinating character. Another one who had a hidden side, which eventually was revealed, but was not initially revealed. And at some point to that group, Kevin came in. He was one of the first people beyond the initial group that we added. Kevin came in kind of sidewise through the games. I mentioned that we had sold game rights to Steve Jackson games, and John did an adaptation of the Wild Card universe to role-playing, which is odd because we had started with role-playing. But then Steve Jackson Game wanted more supplements, and I guess John was busy writing stories for us, so he wasn't available to do it. So Steve Jackson reached out and found some other people, and he found this guy in California that I'd never heard of, who did Aces Abroad, full of characters we'd never heard of, original characters from around the world. We'd done a world travel book, and a few of the characters were included from that book, but you also invented a ton of characters.
Yeah, and George, well, I had read Wild Cards and sort of fallen in love with it and found out that Steve Jackson Games was wanting somebody to write the second book, and I thought, okay, that's good, and maybe I can get myself in to write this. Well, I better write the game book first, and so after I sent the manuscript in, George loved the characters, some more than others.
Some of the characters, yes.
Yes, and but yeah, yes. I was giving you a setup there, but yeah. But it's the character Hearn remained Hearn, but we changed around his powers a little bit. And Cameo, the original name was Sympathy, which was kind of dumb. And George said, "Well, what about this?" And I finally realized that the way Cameo's power work is that she was a trance channeler. It's basically as if somebody had died and she got their watch and put it on. She could channel their spirit, but she could also, if they had a superpower, she could channel that too. And they would only be there for a while. So basically, they would come back as a cameo. And so I thought, give her something traumatic. Basically, her mother had died, and on her deathbed had given her the heirloom cameo brooch, which pretty much her ancestresses had worn back to the 18th century. So suddenly she had, about 20 women that she could call upon, only a couple of whom ever showed up on stage because, okay, in 1920s gun mall, that's useful. She, the great aunt who can, hotwire a car. But most of the other ones, not showing up so much.
And we accepted Kevin into the group, and we used some of his characters, and ultimately, you actually wrote a story for that, I think, which was for the first Card Shark book, right? Was your first actual story. So his characters appeared in the books before he appeared as a writer in the books. Both Hearn as a I don't know, villain and antagonist, a major force in book 11,
Yeah.
and cameo at some point came in here.
Yeah, she was in 11 as well. She was in John's plotline.
Right. And Michael came in a little later, I think, although you wouldn't know that because we've added to some of the old books, and now he's in book 1, but he wasn't originally in
I was in book
one.
4.
You were in book 4, yes, you were in the first of the
How quickly they forget.
the books, yes. You were in, you created our first,
Polyakov.
not our first, Vic created our first Russian character, but you created the
second.
second one, yes.
Perhaps our third.
And exposed a little of the history of the wildcards in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it was fun. I had an interest in the Soviet Union, Soviet technology and science going back years and years, and George said, "Well, why don't you do that?" And being the apparently easy, faithless writer I am, I said, sure, why not? But it was fun playing in that, and I, bounced from volume 4 to, can't remember what the first Bane book was.
That was Card Sharks.
Card Sharks. I was in that one with a space story, and then I was in.
Yeah, Mike, of course, is one of the leading experts on the United States and the Soviet space programs, and has written many books about that, the history of manned space flight. He occasionally shows up at the dinner with Deke Slayton, or did when Deke was alive.
It's more
And,
difficult now.
Yeah. He wrote the biography of Deke Slayton and things like that. So he's become our resident. How is the space program different in the wildcard universe? And Mike has figured
Utter
all that
failure
out.
at that. But yeah.
And
Yeah.
it is different because, when aliens land in 1946, that changes the whole parameters, especially when they kill 10,000 people in New York. That leads the government to say, maybe we need to put a lot more money into space and develop defenses and shit.
Yep. So yeah, it was fun to play in all those worlds. I always felt somewhat divorced because a lot of my stories, because of the nature of where they were set, didn't really cross over a lot with some of the others. Although when I had a chance to go back and do one for Volume 1, I think I used Walter John's folks, and that was fun to play in that. So
Yes,
That's
that
right,
was
yeah.
that was startling because Aces Abroad, the 4th volume, was our world tour where we sent a bunch of characters around the world to see what effect the wildcard had in other countries and all that. And when we got to London and the Polyakov story, we see this Soviet agent who's talking about there's a secret commie spy among the tour, and who will it be? And then it's revealed to be Tachyon, which startled the hell out of me when I read it. I don't know, did it startle the hell out of you, Melinda?
yes, you're the last to know there. It's the only thing you didn't know. We have other secrets, by the way.
Yes. What happened to Polyakov? He sort of disappeared. Is he still alive?
I think he's immolated himself. I mean, Putin got him by now, or whatever Putin is in. Well, Putin's in all worlds. So, yeah, I think Polyakov is long gone. Sage has to leave.
So we ran 12 volumes with Bantam Books, which was our initial publisher in the United States. Mostly doing 3 books contracts. We had our first 3 books, and then we did a second triad, which oddly enough expanded into 4 books because the book 6, when we delivered it, was monstrously large, and I said it's too long to publish. We divided it into 2 books. And then we did yet another one, and that one we also worked in some novels. Melinda did a solo novel, and Vic did a solo novel. So we had a Tachyon Gets Back to Takis novel, and we had a Captain Trips in Vietnam novel to end our first thing. And then we wanted more money because we're greedy writers, and we always like to get more money. And Bantam wouldn't give us more money, so we switched to Bain Books, a rival publisher who offered us a substantial increase in the advance. This was a mistake, ladies and gentlemen, so let me tell any of you who are writers, don't always go where the most money is. Sometimes it doesn't work out. Bantam had been keeping all the backlist in print, and suddenly when we got to another publisher, they put all the backlist out of print. Also, they didn't put any promotion behind the last two books, which mostly sunk Vic's novel, volume 12, Without a Trace. It didn't do a lot for books 10 or 11 either. And then we switched to Baen, but we began, and Baen said, well, who's going to read volume 13 of a series? Let's start the numbering all over. And that was with the Card Shark books, as they were called. And that's where Sage came in and joined us in the Card Shark thing with her character, Zoe. And you were just, I don't know, getting started as a writer then?
I
And
was, but here I was in New Mexico, and you know, if you are in New Mexico and George Martin says, "Come write a story for us," you do that. And Zoe is an animator. She has slightly a bit of nanotechnology and physics involved in what she does because she has to be able to blow, at least breathe on something before she can change it. And she ended up in a huge adventure in the Mideast with various other folks that you'll probably be hearing about. But here's the deal: she went into pretty much hiding after the events in Jerusalem, about which you will probably hear, and when you're discussing these three Card Shark books. And because I have to take off about now, I have to tell you that her future history is now part belongs to Daniel and Melinda, and they probably can't tell you what she's going to do next. Okay?
actually, we've made a change here. It now belongs to Carrie and Linda.
Carrie and Melinda, okay.
Surprise, surprise.
I did not know that until this moment. Danny's totally unreliable. Okay, that's quite all right. But as far as the rest of that trilogy, I'm going to let other people fill in because
Okay.
I've got to get out of here. And that probably leads to Daniel.
A number of wildcard characters, not in addition to wearing costumes, don't like their ace names. You know, my character, Popinjay, hates to be called Popinjay. Walter's character, Pop-Tart, hates to be called Pop-Tart. And Sage's character did not really like her ace name of Blowjob. For reasons that I can't comprehend, but, you know.
I'm responsible for that. We had a phone conversation. Says, "What's her ace name?" And I said, "Somebody's going to nickname her Blowjob." And then Sage went and ran with that.
So, Daniel, the Baen books didn't sell as well as the Bantam books. Baen is a much smaller publisher. They didn't put a lot of promotion behind it, and also the fact that the last two Bantam books had done poorly. People were ordering from the net, and then they looked at it and said, "Oh, Wildcard doesn't do that well anymore, so we'll order less." So we had 3 books with Baen, and then they dropped the series. And even though I think those Card Shark books, which are sadly long out of print and now go for $100 each on eBay, are some of our best books. Card Sharks, Mark Cards, Black Trump, terrific books. And we brought in Sage for that. We brought in Laura Mixon, who created some great characters, and that was really a nice thing. So we were dark for 7 years, and the series seemed to be dead. But eventually we came back, at least in a little way, with a publisher named Byron Price and iBooks. And he started reprinting some of the old books, which Bantam had reverted to us, and also bought 2 new books. One of them was a solo novel by John, which is called Death Drawers 5. Byron Price, unfortunately, was killed in an automobile accident on a Long Island expressway, and his company folded up shortly after his death. And John's book was published a week before the company folded up, so Death Drawers 5 is another one that's hard to find. Before that, though, we had a Deuces book called Deuces Down, and that's where Daniel joined us, initially with a story about a Jokertown priest, where you basically picked up on a gap you noticed in the early books when Father Squid, John's character, was on the world tour, who was ministering to his parishioners.
Yeah, I did the fill-in priest, whose power was to turn water into cheap Merlot. And who, who, when he got this power as a teenager, did the only natural thing, which was to become an alcoholic. And then it was, did quite well for him. And the other thing that was his kind of secret power was he was going against Demise, who we talked about earlier, who killed by making eye contact, and Father Henry was terribly nearsighted. The intention was always to have Father Henry come in and face down this amazing killer and get all of the money and the really cute girl, and then vanish forever from the universe, which he has done.
Ah, yes, indeed. But you were not able to vanish successfully from the universe because we brought you back here. So why don't we keep you, but we'll get rid of Michael and Kevin, and we'll bring up Carrie, Caroline, and Christopher.
I was not warned about this.
He does, yes. Because what happened after, iBooks brought us back after 7 years in a little way. But then iBooks went away, and we were free again. We were homeless again. But this time we settled with Tor, our present publisher, who decided not to timidly relaunch the series as iBooks had, but to relaunch it in a big way with a full triad, 3-book series. And the first of them, Inside Straight, Busted Flush, Suicide Kings, was our triad. And this is where all of these people came in through a concept that Carrie came up with called American Hero. Tell us a little about American Hero.
So one of the first things we do when we put these novels together is we pitch characters to George. And I pitched a character, and part of this character's backstory, the character never got, George nixed the character, so you'll never, I don't even remember very much about him at this point. But his backstory is that he was the runner-up on the first season of a reality show called American Hero. Because of course there's going to be a reality competition show in the Wild Cards universe, given what TV has been like for the last 20 years. And so George nixed the character, but he said, this American Hero idea, tell me more. And before I knew it, it was the book. And we were emailing back and forth and coming up with contestants, dozens and dozens of potential contestants. And I think we ended up mapping out like 2 entire seasons at least.
I now have all 9.
Okay. Okay, there we go. So yeah, it was a throwaway line in a character backstory, and it turned into a huge.
Yeah, when I said we were going to start the show in American Hero with this reality competition show, of course, people pitched me stories and people pitched me characters. But, I looked about it and said, okay, this whole thing is based on playing cards, right? So each team has to have 7 players to start with, and there has to be 4 suits there, because you play 7-card stud, and there's always hearts, clubs, spades, and diamonds. So that meant 28 characters. So there was a lot more room for people to come up with characters. Now, this is where Daniel came in, and of course he didn't come back with Henry Opes, but he stepped up to do the interstitial story, which is the story that knits all the other stories together. And he invented a character, his continuing character, Jonathan Hive. Blogger and bon vivant and a guy who turns into bugs. Say a little about Jonathan, if you would, here.
Here's the thing. Okay, first meta comment. When Wild Cards started off, it was really edgy and punk because that was the time that it was in. And with the relaunch, we had decades of being edgy and dark and punk and making things progressively more terrible, and until we had reached a kind of, as a culture, a sort of Sin City level of self-parody. And I thought it would be fun if we were punk again. And at that point, being funny and kind of goofy and compassionate becomes punk. And so I wound up with Jonathan Hive, who, he turns into his own equivalent mass in insects, but really he wants to be a journalist. Everybody has superpowers, and, but what really changes the world is the power of the word. He's not good, but he was well intentioned, sort of. By well intentioned, I mean self-promoting, and his idea was to get into this reality show and kind of use it for his writing and to fuel his career as a writer. So he got kicked out like the first round. He didn't make it at all. He was like the first among losers. And the first among losers is actually a pretty good just description of him generally. I've been describing him to George as the kind of guy who can come across something and immediately kind of trip over a deep human insight and a really powerful view of what the human heart is capable of, and then walk away completely untransformed. And the first entry we had for him in the Inside Straight was, who the fuck was Jet Boy? The whole world really divides. History divides into two phases. There's before the internet and after the internet. And then before the internet, there was this thing with the Jet Boy thing who was an ace, but before there were aces, and who died, and what? And then before him was Napoleon or something. And that was
we
that was the
created
voice
the
I wanted.
millennial superhero.
Is he a YouTube star? Would he be a YouTube star? No.
He would try.
Working for that million hits there.
And the other thing is, he has no idea that he's a joker. Yeah. Well, he doesn't think he's a joker. He's not disgusting. What are you talking about? He's a journalist. So.
Now, Christopher, we recruited you at that time.
Yes.
I think it was Lou Shiner who you knew who recommended you.
I
Lou
think
wasn't
that is
writing
true.
for us anymore, but he was still finding talents here. And Christopher created a character called Theodorus, who you're going to be hearing a lot more of in books to come. But it wasn't Theodorus who made it into these books. It was a throwaway character you made to fill out the ranks of the
Who also wound
Spades.
up. Yeah.
Hard Hat,
Yeah.
who you played last year.
Yes. Hard
Right.
Hat 2.
He has a wonderful vocabulary, which you don't want to do anymore.
I do not. I just saw a child driven from the room already. So, my question for you, George, is: do you want me to talk about Hard Hat, or do you want the true secret history of how Theodorus came to be?
Sure. Give us the secret history of
All right, you
Theodorus.
have to promise not to fire me when I tell you this about where I stole this idea.
Oh, dear. Okay.
All right, George asked me to come up. George invited me into Wild Cards, which thrilled me. I mean, Carrie can speak to this more than I can even, but it's a big deal when you get an email from George R.R. Martin asking you to write a story for this, for at least it was for me and a lot of writers. So I needed to come up with some kind of superhero-ish type character. And so I had read all the Wild Cards books that had been published to date, and I knew, American superhero comics do not map exactly onto Wild Cards. The way those superpowers work in comics do not work that way in the Wild Cards books. But still, there's design space out there that maybe I can fill in. Is there a guy that does this? Is there a woman that can do that? So I started thinking about my favorite heroes, and I started thinking about, they don't have anybody that can shrink really small. So I went on the internet to read about the Atom. And when I read about the Atom on Wikipedia, I read, well, his name is Ray Palmer. And Ray Palmer is named after somebody. Click. Ray Palmer was an editor in the golden age of science fiction at Galaxy, is that right? Galaxy Magazine?
Amazing.
Amazing, okay. And so I kept clicking, and I kept going deeper and deeper until I found out something called the Shaver Mystery.
Oh, dear. Yes.
And the Shaver Mystery is this set of texts and conversations and events that are perhaps could only happen in the middle of the century in America in the 20th century. And I will not tell you about all of the psychic cannibalistic underdwellers that it concerns, but I eventually came across Robert Shaver encountering in the depths of the hollow earth a snail centaur named Hank. And I said, I don't think there's a snail centaur in Wild Cards.
And you were right.
And that's how I came up with Theodorus.
And we have Theodorus, who you'll be meeting more from later. But he didn't actually get into the committee triad, as we call it. But you were represented there by the late great Hardhead. We also recruited Caroline, another Austinite, who I had known for a long time, and who I recall was enthused when you heard we were doing a reality show-based thing, because you were the one who actually watched reality shows.
Yeah, I'm the one because none of you all ever did that.
No, not us. We were watching Masterpiece Theater. So tell us about the creation of the amazing Bubbles.
I'm sort of embarrassed about this because everybody has such nifty stories about how they created their characters, and I actually don't remember it very well. My husband makes video games and computer games, and for a living, and he's kind of well known anyway. And he's also like filled with hubris, and so I was saying, George called me up or wrote me. I can't remember what it was. Anyway, George kind of contacted me and said, "Hey, would you like to pitch a character for Wild Cards?" And I'm thinking, yes, I would. Thank you very much. And,
Now
but
wait, I
couldn't-
should add a little thing here that Caroline has an association with Wild Cards that goes back to the very first series, because she was part of the Austin group and that I referred to, Howard, Bud, and Lou Shiner. And when they were writing the first series, we had Lou Shiner with Fortunato, the superpowered pimp. And they made Caroline one of his geishas. And then
Yeah, it
Bud
was a
killed her
hoe.
horribly, as I recall.
I killed her mercifully. The astronomer was going to kill her probably. And the mods ended her suffering. I want to go on record.
Okay, yes. So
This is a mighty fine hair to be splitting there, bud.
Caroline is the only person who has been both a wildcard character and a wildcard writer. So I figured we should give her an advantage to get her revenge. So there was that background. So you knew wildcard.
Yeah, from hoe to rider, and I'm not sure there was a lot of difference there. So anyway, so Warren and I said, George asked me to, pitch a character, and I said, I can't come up with anything. And he's like, oh, I can come up with a bunch of characters, just watch. And so we sit down, and he starts writing down all these characters, and I'm stymied. And then I come up with this idea for a character who shoots bubbles, and she can make them blow up. And that's how they started off. Of course, later on, she became filled with plot because she can pretty much do anything with her bubbles. And I like to thank Ian Tregellis for lending me that phrase. But then I sort of, and I don't know how the taking damage and storing it in its fat came about, but it turned out to be pretty awesome. And George actually called me up after I pitched this. I don't know if you remember this. And he said, how about if she blows the bubbles out of her mouth? And I was like, no. and then he said, well, at least I didn't suggest something else. And I'm like, God, I love fart jokes, but no. So that's, I mean, honestly, in the midst of time, I'm not really sure how her taking damage and fat going up thing, but it ended up working out pretty well because according to Melinda, she's the most powerful character in the universe, which is untrue because Theodorus is. And I can name other characters like Little Fat Boy. If she could get close to him. Oh, sorry, we digressed. But anyway, so
This book, is this something that happens?
never mind. Anyway, so and I also got to make Ink and Tiffany. And Ink you didn't let me, because I wanted Ink to she gets tattoos and she can change her skin, and I wanted her to be a cephalopod. And George nixed that, and I was really sad about it because she would have been awesome as a cephalopod. Yeah. And Tiffany had the awesome power of being able to have diamond hard skin and have nothing else going for her. So those
But
are
she
my characters.
glittered very prettily.
Yeah, she did. She glittered, and she became a model, and was able to support her family in West Virginia.
And you wrote a story for Inside Straight that truly captured the poisonous, venomous treachery of a reality show.
Yeah, metagames.
Yeah, which is basically, this is one of the discussions that my husband and many of his gamer friends who would watch reality shows would talk about. Oh, they're all playing the metagame, and what's the metagame going to be this week? And it was like, okay, fine, whatever. So there you have that.
And meanwhile, getting back to Carrie here, who created American Hero, but also created two. Well, you created 3 characters for it. Wild Fox was just a kind of throw-in
Was-
character
yeah,
to
it
fill
was
out
one
the
of the
ranks. But although
red
he was a
shirts,
lot
but
of
not
fun,
really.
and he's
Yeah.
going to be coming back. But your 2 main characters were Earth Witch and Curveball.
Curveball. Yeah. Yeah, and I don't think I originally designed them to be contestants, but once the American Hero thing happened, it ended up providing the backstory for a lot of characters, which I think has been really interesting and fun. So one of the things we talked about was we needed kind of more powerful women characters, kind of A-list powers. There's a lot of women characters in Wild Cards, but not necessarily ones who can deal out a lot of damage in the kind of traditional superhero kind of way. So that was a task I set for myself. Is let's see if I can come up with a couple of really powerful, badass women heroes. And there's been a lot of discussion over the last few years about just how poorly designed a lot of women characters in comics actually are, with kind of the anti-gravity attributes, let's call them, and the weird spines that can somehow show both their attributes and their other attributes at the same time. And the boob window and the outfit and just, and what it comes down to is a lot of the women superheroes in comics are modeled on like Betty Page. They're modeled on pinups. They're modeled on supermodels. They're not modeled on heroes. well, I'm thinking athletes. If you want to design a really powerful woman hero, you would model her on like Jackie Joyner Kersee or Mia Hamm. Or one of those. And so that's what I set out to do. And I don't know if you've ever watched women's fast pitch softball at the collegiate level. Wow, those women, you don't want to stand in front of them ever at all. So I made Curveball, who would have been a collegiate softball player, softball pitcher, if her wild card hadn't turned and banning her from most sports. But boy, she can blow shit up when she throws it, and that's pretty awesome. I kind of was expecting her to be my viewpoint character when I was pitching stories and things, but that ended up not happening because I also came up with Earth Witch, and for her, I wanted to design a character who didn't look like a hero much at all, or at least didn't look like any of the typical comic book or TV or movie heroes that we'd been seeing up to that point. So she's a very average-looking Latina woman. Who grew up in Las Vegas, New Mexico, just up the road. And then I kind of did what you did. It's like, what powers have we not seen in Wild Cards? And the thing you discover when you're trying to design superheroes, at that point, Wild Cards have been around for 20 years. Superhero comics and superhero worlds in general had been around for 60 years at that point. It's really hard coming up with powers that haven't been used before. Or names, that's the other thing, trying to come up with superhero names, and you're sitting there Googling, and it's like, oh my gosh, there's this obscure character from 1963 who appeared in one issue. But you can't use that name, because there's somebody out there who's gonna call you on it, because there are people who know everything. But it turns out Wild Cards had never had an Earth Mover. The sort of Terra kinesis kind of thing. So Earth Witch was born. La Bruja de la Tierra she's a very average-looking person who can really mess shit up, which is great. And the other thing I did is I made them best friends, which was not also not something that was kind of planned out from the beginning, but it worked out really well. And I really enjoyed not just writing about those characters, but writing about them together, kind of tag teaming and looking out for each other.
There are a lot more women friendships now in Wild Cards than there used to be too, which I think has been a really good change. So
I think it's generally true that not only do not the wildcard characters not wear costumes, but most of them don't look like comic book characters. And when you really think about it, there's no reason, that getting the power to fly should, automatically make you look like an Olympic athlete or a Playboy model. In either case, getting the ability to shoot lightning bolts from your fingers. Well, a little fat, dumpy guy can shoot lightning bolts from his fingers just as well as someone with a six-pack and giant bodybuilder muscles. You don't need to build bodies to shoot lightning bolts. And we've taken that, in wild cards, and of course, it is somewhat an issue that we are dealing with, Melinda and I, when we're trying to develop as a TV show, because they don't really understand us in Hollywood. We have to explain it very carefully. We don't necessarily want the usual CW cast of really
They're so
beautiful
pretty.
people here. We want some people who look like people, and so forth. But American Hero was a lot of fun, and of course led to the two books that followed, Busted Flush and Inside Straight, Busted Flush, and Suicide Kings, where we got to bring back this mix of new characters with some old characters, like the Radical story, and finally wrapped up. And Bud introduced another character called Little Fat Boy, who has really kind of formidable power.
Or unfortunate.
Both, yes, both. But and we dealt with all of them. So why don't we shuffle you guys off and bring up our final group here of Diana Rowland, both Davids, two Davids, and Mary Ann.
We're all going to sit up here. Yeah, we're all going to. That's right. We're going to be.
So this is our latest, but not our last generation of wildcard writers who came in some cases for the Fort Freak triad, which is the one that followed the committee, which is our mean streets going into Jokertown. The Jokers are central to Wildcard. They've been there from the very beginning, but we haven't told a lot of stories about them. But we're telling more stories about them now and setting these stories in Jokertown. And then the ones that follow, the series that is in the can now, but you haven't seen it yet, the America Triad: Mississippi Roll, Texas Hold'em, Low Chicago. So let's see. I think Marianne, you were one of the first to come in with Fort Freak, right?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, and you gave us two more women characters, and also a male who enjoys both of them.
Yes, yeah. So when George invited me into Wildcards, I was, of course, thrilled, but I'm actually maybe less of a superhero aficionado than many. I was familiar with Sandman and some of the more recent things. I love Saga, but I had not spent decades reading superhero comics, and so I was mostly drawing on my own background. I wrote erotica for 10 years and then mainstream lit for 10 years, and it was sort of at the tail end of that, as I was moving into science fiction, that I was invited into Wildcards. So the characters I came up with were based a little bit on my own life, not exactly, but I'm poly, I'm bi. I have been, I spent years in a threesome, and I felt that Wildcards could use more of that energy. So, so that's what I came up with. So Michael is a Nat. He's a cop. He is involved.
A cop at Fort Freak, which is the 5th precinct of New York. It's the Jokertown precinct. So just like you have Fort Apache and things like that in real life, Fort Freak is the name that they've dubbed the 5th New York City precinct, where some of the cops are jokers, some are aces or deuces, and some are nats, like
Michael's just
Michael.
a guy trying to do a hard job, right?
Right.
He's involved with Kavita, who goes by Natya as her ace name. She's sort of an ace who doesn't want to be an ace. She is Sri Lankan, like me. She saw the war when she was little and saw people killed in front of her. She's a pacifist, or at least she thinks she is, until their toddler daughter gets kidnapped. And then she discovers that maybe she's willing to kick some ass. She's a dancer, and her power was based. It's a little Sue Stormy. See, I know a little bit about superheroes. So, in that she could make force fields, but she was using them to dance on, and sort of build them up. And there's a tradition in South Asia of Bharatanatyam, which is a very high energy dance form, and as you're studying it, at the end you do this graduation performance, which is you, an audience of 500 to 1,000 people typically. You're probably somewhere between ages 12 and 16, and you do a 2-hour solo dance, very intensive, very highly structured. So I watched my sister, cousins go through this, and I was struck just by how physically brutal it was, right? To do that, there's a snake dance where you're like whipping your body around for a long time, up and down and up and down. And so Natia's power, she has to fuel it. It's a pretty strong power. She can make all kinds of things with her force fields, but only as long as she keeps dancing. If she stops, boom, it just winks out whatever it is. So if she's in the middle of a fight with mobsters and she runs out of energy, it's a problem.
You also gave us, as part of your alternative family there, an ace child, which is something we haven't dealt with a lot in Wildcard. We've touched on it time and again. But if you think the terrible twos are terrible, when the 2-year-old has superpowers, it
She
can
can
be
turn
even
into
more
a
problem.
Garuda, which is sort of like a dragon, not really, but like a South Asian kind of creature with big wings and so on, which is also. And then the third member of the relationship is Minal, who's a joker. And she's honestly inspired by the triple-breasted whore of Eroticon 6. But Minal has more than 3 breasts. She has many, and she's an actual whore, and she shows up. Michael knows her from time working Vice, and she shows up on their doorstep in trouble, and then complications ensue.
Now, David, your character also appeared in the Fort Freak book for the first time. Which one? Oh, the one, yes, that David, yes. Both Davids appeared in Fort Freak, actually. We're going this direction here. And tell us the origins of IBT.
Okay. Well, yeah, I got that email from George with the, hey, are you interested in, maybe joining this world? And did you love comic books when you were a kid? And I said, yeah, sure. But I wasn't a particularly big comic reader, actually. And it was well-timed, though, for it to be Fort Freak and entering into a Joker moment, because my inclinations, leaned much more toward dealing with jokers and misfits and people struggling in one way or another. So, my spin on the character creation is to talk about how much it was a collaborative process, right? So, obviously, writing in this world is a collaborative process in many ways, but for me, creating my character was. Because there was an email exchange, went on for a while, where I'm proposing this character, and George says, no, that sucks, or something like that. And I propose another character, and he says, we've done that like 5 times already. Or I give a power, and it's like, no more, that power is nixed. That went on for a while. And I'm there going, is this going to work out? And I don't know if this is how it really happened, but it's how I remember it. I'm on the couch, not coming up with anything good. And I kind of look over at my son, who was right there, the young man here with a bit of hair. And he's 7 at the time. And he has this folder in his lap, like kind of a binder. And what was it called? Sage's Secret Squadron of Superheroes. Indeed. And it's kind of like, can I take a look at that? And indeed, it was a book of superheroes and mutants. He would have drawings of them and their name and their powers and like their origin story. So I began flipping through. And there was Light Liquor, and Downright Impossible. Who else? Yeah. And Black Tongue was one of them as well. So I wrote the next email to George, included those characters and.
So you stole your kid's idea.
Collaboration. And there was an uptick of interest on George's part, and I think you said, "Tell me more about this Black Tongue." So, okay, the character who became the infamous Black Tongue was certainly not fully formed in his version. There's an illustration of him, and I believe his power was that he was in human form, but he could kind of stick his tongue out, like spit his tongue out, and it would stretch all the way around the world, and he could touch the back of his head. I was like, that's cool, but what's the use, really? So we began kicking around other ideas, and George had input as well. And the tongue stuck, that the tongue was going to be something that he could use as a weapon, indeed. And I think I had a stupid idea with him having frog legs, and it was a bit of a frog thing, half frog, half man. Sage says that wasn't his idea, and it's probably right. Anyway, we found a much better one, it seems. And his tongue is venomous as well. And we went with a snake, a half human torso, and a snake lower regions, and also other things. So that was like the physicality of this character that it kind of worked for us and worked for George. Other things about him, though, he's an African American, and that was important to me to see if I could bring in some of my diversity and he came from a upbringing very similar to mine, and there was all that stuff to play with, and.
Now you made him right from the first. I don't know if this developed with the book, but he's a bit of an outcast. I mean, the police are after him. He's not joining the super squadron of Avengers here. He's being hunted by the cops and falsely accused of murder and all of that stuff. Where did all that come from? Did you want to do an outsider as a?
Yeah. Okay. If I was to dig deep and try to place myself in that character, there's a little bit of growing up I grew up in suburban Maryland. African American family, very very middle class, kind of Huxtable-ish, really. I know, sorry. Hey, it was true though.
Without the Quaaludes.
Yeah. And there were a lot of things that early on were expected of me in terms of who I was going to date and what things I was going to do and be interested in, and I was kind of inclined to go entirely different directions than what my family might have expected from me. So this character, when he has his change, because everyone is a Joker, at some point his card turns and then boom, his body changes. His parents are not happy about that. So I suppose if there's a metaphor there, it's that I came out to be something that they did not expect, and that happened in high school when I sort of went off in other directions. So this character gets very much kicked out of his family's life and is on the streets, and then, as happens every now and then with young African American men, he has some issues with the police, and there's that spin on it, and that's what I went with. Yeah.
And he's still going strong. So
Hey,
the current books.
You know what? Yeah. He was in 3 books. He's going to be a character in a couple of the ones to come. And in the second book, I wrote in our character was on the cover.
That's low ball. You can get out there in the lobby there, and maybe you can get both of them to sign it.
He would love that. Although his signature, I don't think he's worked on it so much yet.
So, other David, you also came in with Fort Freak, I believe, and
I came in at the same time as Fort Freak, but my first appearance was actually in book 1, which was published long before I was writing.
Yes, the miracle of time travel.
Yes.
You created a whole bunch of characters, as I recall, and we then it was just a question of which one we could actually fit into the book we were doing.
Yeah, so everybody else has talked about getting this magic email from George. I actually begged for it. I came up to George I mean, I started reading Wild Cards with book one, and so I came up to George. When I had, I had built up a career. I'd gone to Clarion. I'd won a Hugo, and that gave me enough confidence to actually approach him and say, "Hey, is there room for any more writers in Wildcards?" And he said, "Well, there isn't at this time, but we might be recruiting more later on." So I think like 2 years later, George pulls me aside at a party at a Worldcon and says, "Okay, we're adding new people to the consortium. This is your opportunity to pitch." So I pitched a whole bunch of characters. The first few ideas that I had were rejected. No, done that. No, we aren't using that kind of power anymore. Same kind of deal. But I came up with the character called the Recycler, whose power is to draw junk to himself and create this enormous junk body. And then the first book that came up, so he liked the character. He was accepted into everybody's three-ring binders, but he didn't actually appear on stage for quite some time because the first book that came along was Fort Freak, and he was overpowered for Fort Freak. He had been designed to fit into the Committee trilogy, and his powers were just out of scale with the down and dirty Jokertown back alley cop kind of deal that we had with Fort Freak. So the next opportunity, so I didn't pitch him for Fort Freak. He didn't fit in. But there was an opportunity to write new stories for a reissued book one, and so I pitched a couple different characters for that one. The first character I pitched was so the new stories in Volume 1 were filling in holes in the timeline that had been left in the initial publication. So I wanted to do somebody for the 60s. So I pitched an underground comics-based character for the 1960s who was called the Cartoonist. And that wasn't George didn't want that one for book one, but he said, we can repurpose this character for Fort Freak. We can make him be the Fort Freak sketch artist. So he was accepted into Fort Freak, but the character that was actually my first published character was the character Stopwatch, who I invented for the Cuban Missile, the U-2 crisis in the reissued book one. Then the Cartoonist was used. He was mentioned in Fort Freak, but I don't think he appeared on stage until the second Fort Freak book, Lowball.
Lowball, right?
When he actually had his origin story. So he was created for the '60s, but then wound up appearing for the first time in the 21st century. And then finally,
the Cartoonist is another character that I don't think you'll be seeing in mainstream comics very soon. He's a hideously deformed Joker who. People don't like to see on the streets, but he can inhabit the bodies of the cartoons he draws, and he has a stock number of characters, all of which he uses to spy on women getting undressed.
Yeah, he's an ugly little pervert. Basically, that's his superpower.
But a hero.
Yeah, but a hero. Well, the thing is, he starts off as an ugly little pervert and turns heroic over the course of that story. So the Recycler, my originally created character, never appeared on the page, and this has been like years have gone by, and he's never actually appeared. And so George says at one point, I'm really popular in Brazil, and we'd like to thank our Brazilian readers by having a Brazilian character. So I took the Recycler, who had been, he was a Vietnamese American living in New York, and changed him into a Brazilian. So he appeared. I think he was a background character in one of the other stories, but he finally got his chance to appear on stage in a story for Tor.com, his origin story, where he's all in Brazil. And George's, I sent the story to George's Brazilian editor for a fact check. And he said, "I love this story. Can I publish it as a chapbook?" So that actually came out as translated into Brazilian Portuguese as a standalone box set with a poster and a bookmark and 8 collectible trading cards. And it's only available in Brazil. I've never even seen a copy.
Hey, I haven't even seen authors' copies of that yet. Have they sent it to you?
Only,
wow.
It was only published like a month or two ago.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. And so all these characters, the thing is that they seem to get created for one purpose and then eventually get re-edited and repurposed into something else. And that's Yes, yes, you killed. Well, I have quite a few red shirt characters that I've created, for the express purpose of being killed off.
I'm just saying, I'm still getting used to the frequency with which these characters get killed off, or like so the edit I get most often from George on my drafts is you're being too nice to the characters, and you need to crank it up a little bit. So, learning.
And then we come to our most recent addition, whose character has not actually appeared yet, but we will meet her in Texas Hold'em.
Next year, right? About this time next year, right?
Next year, yeah, it's the third of the America book, so it'll be a little lower down the line. The Skeeter.
Well, I've known George for almost 20 years. He was one of my instructors when I went to Clarion West in 1998. That's also how I met Daniel Abraham. Still friends, weird. He actually asked me to write a story about 4 or 5 years ago for his Dangerous Women anthology, and which was cool. I got paid nice money because he sells a lot of books. So that was really cool. And then I got the email that everyone else has gotten, would you like to write for Wild Cards? And I wrote back, I've never read Wild Cards. And so he said, well, I'll send you the books. So he sent me a big box of Wild Card books. And I started reading. And I was like, yeah, okay, this is cool. I'll make something. So I did the same thing with the characters, make him all the characters, and I sent it to him, and he's like, well, nope, not that one, nope, that one, nope, 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 nope. And he liked 2 of them. There was one that was like a bodyguard type of person where he could put up these defensive shield type things. And then another, a 14-year-old girl from southeast Louisiana, which is where I'm from, who could control mosquitoes. Yeah. And then it came time to pitch for the books, and he thought I was going to take my bodyguard guy and pitch for the Steamboat book. But I used Lori Ann Broom, 14-year-old Skeeter girl, and took her to San Antonio, Texas, and wrote a story about her in this whole band competition. And during which I also created another character who didn't get voted out by George, Fart Boy. Fart Boy. I wrote a 10,000-word fart joke, and he bought it from me. So yeah, you'll get to see that in about a year.
Yes, right.
So
and last year you
does
played.
Skeeter Girl have any power over Bugsy?
No, he's her idol. She really wants to meet him someday. Someday. Yeah, and then, when you don't meet your heroes and stuff like that.
But,
Very disappointed.
Last year when we did this, we had people actually role-playing their characters on stage, and I think Skeeter was really disgusted by Bugsy when she learned what he was really like. It was a shocking moment. Heartbreaking.
I have some great pictures of Diana as Skeeter Girl from the death match in Kansas City.
Yes.
I did. I took you bitch out. A 14-year-old kid. I have a 13-year-old, and so I know the power of hormones and mood swings, and you don't stand a chance. Yeah.
So that's the story of Wild Cards, and we've gone 30 years, and we're still just beginning here. We have 4 more books that are delivered that are actually in the pipeline. The America Triad of Low Chicago, Texas Hold'em, and Mississippi Roll that'll be coming out. And we've recently delivered a British book called Knaves Over Queens about the entire history of the wild cards in the British Isle. And we have 2 more books that we're working on that are under contract. And also, some of you may have been reading the free stories on Tor.com. We're going to collect a number of those into a book called Full House. So there'll actually be a book, but you can read them for free online right now if you want to. And there's some great stuff there. So now we're going to wrap this up here. We're going to adjourn to the signing portion of it. Now, we have a great deal of authors. We have a great deal of books here. Not only do we have all of the Wildcard books that are still available in print that you can get signed by as many of the authors as you want, but we have many of our writers write other things besides Wildcards, and we have some of their other books, which hopefully you'll also give a try to. There's an amazing range of genres: science fiction, fantasy, urban fantasy, horror. Our guys write all kinds of things, and they're all very good.